In the summer of 1888, the people of Caldera Valley first began to speak of Maeve Quinn's folly. It was a summer of long, drowsy days when the sun baked the valley floor to a cracked plate and the river ran slow and shallow. It was a time for mending fences and tending stock, for canning peaches and feeling the certainty of the seasons. But Maeve Quinn, a widow of less than a year with 3 small children clinging to her skirts like burrs, was not mending fences. She was felling trees. They would tell the story for generations, long after the whispers had turned to reverence, but in that beginning, they only saw madness. They saw a woman, her face set like stone, and her 12-year-old son, Rowan, his shoulders still too narrow for the axe he swung, working from dawn until the last light bled from the sky. They were not clearing land for a new field. They were not cutting firewood for the coming winter, not in the way a sane person would. They were dragging whole, enormous logs of pine and oak down from the wooded slopes to the small, sad cabin where her husband, Liam, had drawn his last, ragged breath. The cabin was barely large enough for the 4 of them, a single room that was a sweatbox in summer and a cage of ice in winter. And around this cabin, Maeve began to lay the foundations of another. Not beside it. Not as an extension. But around it, a vast and inexplicable shell of a structure, leaving a gap of a man's armspan between the old wall and the new. It was Alastair Finch, a man whose wealth was measured in cattle and whose opinion was measured in volume, who first gave the project its name. Leaning against the hitching post outside the general store, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She's building a coward's cabin," he declared to the gathered men. "Hiding from the world inside a box within a box." A woman's fear given shape in wood, the name stuck. It spread through the valley on currents of gossip and disbelief. The coward's cabin. It was a cruel name, a simple one, and it fit what they could not understand. Why would a widow, with winter coming, waste her strength on such a strange and monumental task? Why would she build a fortress around a hovel? They did not know what she was truly building against, for the enemy she fought was not one that could be seen. It was the memory of a whisper of cold, the ghost of a frost that had settled not on a window pane, but deep within a man's lungs. The scorn of the community was a constant, low hum, like flies buzzing on a hot day. It followed Maeve and her children whenever they had to venture into the small cluster of buildings that passed for a town. Men would stop their conversations and watch her pass, their eyes a mixture of pity and contempt. Women would pull their children a little closer, as if her particular brand of grief-fueled madness might be contagious. Alastair Finch was the loudest voice in the chorus of disapproval. He saw her efforts as an affront to common sense, a foolish waste of good timber that could have been split into a mountain of firewood. "She'll be burning the walls of that monstrosity to stay warm by January," he'd say, earning gruff chuckles from his audience at the saloon. Mark my words, even Gregor, the blacksmith, a man whose judgment was usually as solid and tempered as the steel he worked, shook his head in weary confusion. He was the valley's master craftsman, a man who understood the language of wood and iron, the precise angles of a dovetail joint, the unyielding logic of a load-bearing beam. He watched Maeve and Rowan struggle to notch the massive logs with rudimentary tools, their technique clumsy, their progress agonizingly slow. "The grain is fighting her," he muttered to his apprentice one afternoon, the rhythmic clang of his hammer pausing as they watched the 2 lone figures on the hillside. "She doesn't see the wood for the tree. That structure will never hold its own weight, let alone a winter's snow." His words carried the weight of authority, and his verdict sealed the community's opinion. It was not just folly, it was poor folly. Yet, amidst the derision, there was one quiet dissenter. Martha, who ran the general store with her husband, was a woman whose wisdom was etched in the fine lines around her eyes. She watched Maeve trade her last few preserved vegetables for a bag of nails and a length of rope. She saw not madness in Maeve's eyes, but a terrifying, unblinking resolve. While others saw a woman retreating from the world, Martha saw a woman preparing for a war. She gave Maeve an extra measure of flour and said nothing of payment. "A hard winter is coming, child," was all she offered, her voice low and soft. "The aspens are shedding early." Maeve simply nodded, her gratitude a silent weight in the air between them. "I know," she whispered, and the words held a chill that had nothing to do with the changing season. She and Rowan worked on. The twin girls, Ilara and Iris, were too small for the heavy lifting, but they did their part, gathering moss and stripping bark with small knives, their faces smudged with dirt, their movements mirroring their mother's quiet intensity. Rowan's hands, once soft, were now a landscape of calluses and splinters. He rarely spoke, but a new hardness had settled in his jaw. He was no longer just helping his mother, he was her partner in this silent, desperate crusade. He felt the sting of the town's ridicule more keenly than she seemed to, but one look at her determined face was enough to silence his own doubts. He trusted her. He had to. For he, too, remembered the winter before. The memory that drove her was not a single, violent event, but a slow, creeping thief. It was the memory of the previous winter, the one that had stolen her husband, Liam. He hadn't been taken by a fall from a horse or a fever that burned hot and fast. He had been taken by the cold. Not the howling, dramatic cold of a blizzard, but the quiet, persistent cold that found its way through every chink and crack in their small cabin. It was a cold that lived in the walls, that seeped up from the floorboards, that clung to the blankets like a damp shroud. Liam had caught a cough in November, a simple chest cold that should have passed. But in that cabin, there was no place to get truly warm, no corner where the chill did not reach. The fire in the hearth was a hungry beast, devouring their meager woodpile but offering only a small circle of warmth that the drafts tore to shreds. Maeve remembered waking in the dead of night to the sound of his teeth chattering, a sound that seemed to shake the very bones of the house. She would pile every blanket they owned on top of him, lie beside him, trying to warm him with her own body, but it was like trying to warm a stone plucked from a frozen river. The cold was inside him. She remembered the look in his eyes, the surprise that such a simple thing, the very air he breathed, could be so treacherous. He grew weaker, the cough turning into a wet, rattling sound that was the only noise in the oppressive silence. Rowan would sit by his father's bedside, holding his hand, his young face a mask of confusion and fear. He remembered his father's hand feeling like a bundle of frozen twigs. Maeve remembered the morning she woke up and the rattling had stopped. The silence that replaced it was absolute, a void that swallowed all sound, all warmth, all hope. The air in the cabin was so cold it felt sharp in her throat, and a fine layer of frost had crept across the inside of the wall by his bed. He had not been warm enough. It was that simple, that brutal. The four thin walls of their home, the shelter meant to protect them, had failed. It had been a coffin of cold air. That was the trauma that fueled her now. When Alastair Finch spoke of her cowardice, he could not see the ghost she was fighting. When Gregor criticized her technique, he could not understand that she was not building a house of wood, but a barrier of memory. Every log she and Rowan hauled into place was a stone on Liam's grave. Every notch they cut was an act of defiance against the insidious, seeping cold. She was not building a shelter from the wind or the snow. She was building a fortress against the memory of a husband's last, cold breath, a sound she could still hear in the sigh of the autumn wind. She would not lose another child to a whisper of frost. She would build a house where the cold could not enter, a house where her children could sleep through the coldest night, safe and warm. She would build a house around her house, a shield around her heart, and no one, not the wind, not the winter, not God himself, would steal the warmth from her family again. The point of no return arrived on a crisp October morning when the air had the sharp bite of impending frost. Their supply of dried beans was dwindling, the flour sack was worryingly light, and the twins' boots were thin and cracked. The outer walls of the strange new structure stood half-finished, a skeleton of giant logs surrounding their tiny home, casting long, strange shadows in the morning sun. They needed more nails, a good saw to replace the one that had lost its edge, and salt to preserve the last of the season's rabbit meat. They needed money, and they had none. Maeve stood for a long time in the small lean-to that served as a stable, her hand resting on the smooth, worn leather of Liam's saddle. It was his finest possession, the one thing he had brought with him from a life before the valley, a life of open ranges and cattle drives. It was beautifully made, the leather tooled with a simple, elegant pattern, the silver conchos dull with disuse. It was all she had left of him, besides the children and the cold memory in the cabin. It was a piece of his soul, sitting there on its wooden stand. Selling it felt like a betrayal, like selling a part of his story. Rowan found her there, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the saddle horn. He knew what she was thinking. He had seen his father polish that saddle, had felt the pride in his father's hands as he worked the oil into the leather. "We can't," Rowan said, his voice cracking with the strain of adolescence and emotion. "It's his." Maeve turned to him, and for the first time in months, he saw the raw, brittle grief she kept so tightly locked away. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. "He would want you warm, Rowan," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. "He would trade 1,000 saddles for one warm night for you and your sisters. He would want us to finish this." She stroked the leather one last time, a final, silent goodbye. The decision was made. It was a sacrifice that cut deeper than any physical hardship they had endured. Later that day, she and Rowan rode their only horse bareback into town, the saddle held carefully before her. Alistair Finch was there, of course, holding court on the porch of the general store. He saw the saddle and a smirk curled his lip. "Selling off the past, Maeve," he called out, his voice laced with mock pity. "Won't be needing that where you're hiding." Maeve didn't grace him with a response. She slid off the horse and walked directly to Gregor, the blacksmith, who was shoeing a horse in the dusty street. He was the only man in town who would know its true value. He stopped his work, wiping his hands on a leather apron as he looked from the saddle to her desperate, determined face. He ran a practiced hand over the craftsmanship, recognizing its quality instantly. He knew what it must have meant to her husband. He also knew why she was selling it. He gave her a fair price, a generous one, pressing the coins into her palm without meeting her eyes. It was not an act of charity, but of respect for the sacrifice he was witnessing. As they left the store, their arms laden with supplies, Rowan walked taller. The sale of his father's saddle had changed something in him. The last vestige of his childhood had been traded for nails and salt. He now understood the full weight of their undertaking. It was no longer his mother's strange project. It was their family survival, bought and paid for with the most precious thing they had left to sell. There was no turning back. They were all in, together. The work took on a new urgency as the days grew shorter and the nights colder. The money from the saddle was a finite resource, a ticking clock against the coming winter. With a new, sharp saw and plentiful nails, the construction of the outer shell progressed more quickly. Rowan, now driven by the gravity of their sacrifice, worked with a man's strength, his movements becoming more sure and efficient. He learned to read the grain of the wood, to anticipate how a log would settle, his actions now an extension of his mother's will. They worked as a team, a silent, synchronized unit. The process was a marvel of simple physics and brutal effort. They would fell a tree on the slope above the cabin, trim its branches, and then, using ropes and levers, guide the massive log down the hill. Getting it into place was the hardest part. They built an earthen ramp against the rising wall. With Maeve on one side and Rowan on the other, they would roll the log, inch by painful inch, up the ramp until it was high enough to be levered into its resting place atop the log below it, settling into the crudely cut notches with a ground-shaking thud. The sound echoed through the valley, a steady, percussive heartbeat of their relentless labor. The townspeople watched the walls rise higher and higher, the structure growing more monstrous with each passing day. It dwarfed the original cabin, which was now completely hidden from view within the new wooden skeleton. It looked like a giant's crude attempt at building a blockhouse, windowless and grim. The space between the inner and outer walls remained, a dark, mysterious corridor that ran the perimeter of their home. What was it for? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The first snows came early that year, not a gentle dusting but a wet, heavy blanket that clung to the trees and turned the ground to mud. The wind that carried it had a new, vicious edge. It was a promise of what was to come. Alistair Finch rode by one afternoon, his horse picking its way through the slush. He stopped at the edge of their clearing, looking up at the half-finished roof. "That thing will catch the wind like a sail, Maeve," he shouted over the rising gale. "It'll tear the roof right off and bring the whole damn thing down on your heads." Maeve, standing on a makeshift scaffold with Rowan, securing a rafter, did not even look down. She just hammered another nail home, the sharp, metallic sound a clear and final answer. Her silence infuriated him more than any argument could have. He saw it as stubborn foolishness, an unwillingness to accept the wisdom of her betters. He rode off, shaking his head, more convinced than ever that the woman was dangerously insane. But Gregor, the blacksmith, was beginning to see something different. From his forge at the edge of town, he had a clear view of the Quinn homestead. He watched them work through the first snow, their movements unceasing. He had dismissed her methods as amateurish, but now he saw the logic in their seeming madness. She wasn't building a normal house. She wasn't trying to create fine joints or elegant lines. She was building for mass. For sheer, unyielding bulk. She was building not against the snow, but against the cold that the snow carried. He was a master of his craft, and he was witnessing the creation of something entirely outside his knowledge, born not of skill, but of pure, primal necessity. For the first time, a seed of doubt was planted in his mind. What if she wasn't a fool? What if she knew something they all had forgotten? The outer shell was finally complete, the massive roof of split logs and packed earth sealing the structure just as the first serious frost began to silver the world each morning. From the outside, the coward's cabin was an imposing, almost frightening sight. It was a windowless block of wood and earth, twice the height and 3 times the width of a normal cabin, with a single, heavy door set deep into its thick wall. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb. The true genius of Maeve's design, however, lay in the space no one could see. The gap between the old, drafty cabin walls and the new, massive outer shell was the heart of her invention. This was the work that occupied them now. It was messy, back-breaking labor. Maeve sent the girls into the woods to gather bags and bags of dry moss and fallen leaves. Rowan dug up load after load of rich, dark earth from the forest floor, a soil thick with centuries of decomposed pine needles. They packed this material into the gap between the walls. First, a thick layer of moss pressed against the inner cabin, then a layer of dry leaves, and finally, they packed the rest of the space tight with earth, tamping it down with heavy posts until it was as dense as a brick wall. They were, in effect, burying their home. They were insulating it with the very earth itself, creating a thermal barrier several feet thick. Gregor, his curiosity finally overcoming his skepticism, rode out one afternoon on the pretense of checking on their horse. He found Maeve and her children covered in dirt, packing the last of the earthen insulation into the northern wall. He watched for a long time, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He saw how the layers were constructed, how the dry, airy moss and leaves created pockets of trapped air, and how the dense earth provided the final, impenetrable shield. Insulation, he said, the word coming out as a slow revelation. Maeve paused, looking at him. Her face was smudged with soil, her hair matted with sweat and pine needles, but her eyes were clear and steady. The earth stays warm, she said simply. It wasn't an explanation. It was a statement of fact. Gregor looked at the massive, ugly structure, and for the first time, he saw it not as a folly, but as a solution. A brutal, inelegant, but possibly brilliant solution to a problem he had never considered so deeply. He had always fought the cold with a bigger fire. Maeve was fighting it by refusing to let it in. He nodded slowly, a profound respect dawning in his eyes. He didn't offer to help, he knew the offer would be refused, that this was something she had to complete on her own, but he said, "Your husband was a good man. He would be proud of your strength." It was the first kind word from a man in town she had heard in months. It was a small crack in the wall of scorn, a glimmer of understanding that gave her a flicker of renewed strength to see the final, exhausting task through. They were ready. The winter could come. The world inside the walls was transformed. To enter the coward's cabin was to leave the world behind. First, one opened the heavy outer door, stepping into a narrow, dark corridor, the insulated space between the walls. It was like entering a cave, the air still and silent, the smell of damp earth and moss filling the senses. Another few steps led to the original, familiar door of their old cabin. Pushing that door open was like stepping from a deep cellar into a warm kitchen. The change was breathtaking. The single room of the inner cabin, once a place of drafts and creeping chill, was now a sanctuary of profound and steady warmth. The small iron stove, which before had struggled to heat a few feet around it, now filled the entire space with a gentle, consistent heat. The air was still. The oppressive, ever-present drafts were gone. The silence was the most remarkable thing. The autumn winds could be howling outside, rattling the trees and moaning across the valley, but inside Maeve's inner sanctum, there was only a deep, muffled peace. It was as if the house were holding its breath. The twins, Ilara and Iris, who had spent the previous winter huddled in blankets with pinched, blue-tinged fingers, now played on the floorboards in their bare feet, their laughter echoing in the warm, safe space. For the first time since their father's death, the cabin felt like a home again, not a trap. Rowan felt the change in his very bones. The constant, gnawing tension in his shoulders began to ease. He could sit and read by the fire without shivering, the warmth seeping into him, chasing away the memory of his father's frozen hand. He looked at his mother, who sat quietly darning a sock, her face placid in the lantern light. He finally understood. She had not been building a monument to her fear, she had been building them a womb, a place to be safe and warm until the world was safe again. The first true blizzard of the season arrived in late November. It came without warning, a wall of white that descended from the mountains and swallowed the valley whole. The townspeople hunkered down, stuffing rags into the cracks in their walls, feeding their fires, and bracing for a long, cold night. From his well-built ranch house, Alastair Finch watched the snow piling up against his door. A bit of a blow, he said to his wife with confidence, but this house is strong. He felt a moment of dark satisfaction thinking of Maeve Quinn in her ridiculous wooden box. He imagined the wind tearing at its clumsy roof, the snow piling up against its foolishly thick walls. He was sure that by morning, they would find it collapsed, and he would be proven right. He added another log to his roaring fire, feeling the secure pride of a man who knows how the world works. But as the night wore on, the wind rose to a demonic shriek. It was a sound no one in the valley had ever heard before. It tore at his roof, finding a weakness in the shingles, and soon a fine spray of snow began to sift down into their attic, then through the ceiling boards into the main room. The cold came with it, an aggressive, invading force that the fire could not beat back. His children began to cry, their blankets doing little to ward off the insidious chill. The cold was winning. It had been winning all winter. The storm was not a storm, it was a living entity. It was a predator of unimaginable fury, a great white beast that had descended from the highest peaks to reclaim the valley. The wind did not howl, it screamed. It sounded like 1,000 grieving mothers, a sound that pierced the thickest logs and chilled the very marrow in a man's bones. Snow did not fall, it flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring blizzard of ice particles that stung any exposed skin and buried the world in a matter of hours. In the town, chaos reigned. Roofs were being peeled back like the lids of tins. Livestock, caught in the open, froze where they stood. The temperature plummeted to depths no one could remember, a cold so profound it felt like the world itself was dying. In Alastair Finch's sturdy ranch house, the situation was desperate. The hole in his roof had widened, and a thick drift of snow was now piling up in the corner of the main room, melting and refreezing into a sheet of ice that crept across the floor. The fire hissed and sputtered as drafts attacked it from all sides. His wife was trying to comfort their 2 young children, who were shivering violently, their lips tinged with blue. They had piled every blanket, every coat, every scrap of fabric on their bed, but the cold was relentless. It was in the room with them, a palpable presence. Alastair, his face a mask of disbelief and growing terror, knew they would not last the night. His pride, his certainty, his wealth, all of it was meaningless against this elemental rage. The house he had built with such pride was failing them. He looked at his son, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, and he saw not a coming winter, but a coming death, the same quiet, creeping death that had taken Liam Quinn. And in that moment of pure, unadulterated fear, he thought of the one place in the valley that was different. The coward's cabin. The absurd, monstrous, foolish structure he had mocked all summer. He thought of its windowless walls, its incredible thickness. He thought of the earth packed between its layers. It was a fool's hope, a madman's gamble, but it was the only hope he had. "Stay here," he yelled to his wife over the roar of the wind. "Keep them moving." He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and plunged out into the white hell. The force of the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. He couldn't see more than a few inches in front of his face, but he knew the direction of the Quinn place by heart. He stumbled and fell, crawling on his hands and knees when the wind was too strong, the ice particles flaying his skin. It was a journey of a few hundred yards that felt like 100 miles. He was driven by a single, terrifying image, his children, silent and still, under a blanket of snow inside their own home. He almost missed it. The cabin was so buried in snow, so silent, that it had become part of the landscape. Only the dark shape of the outer door, kept clear by a small overhang, was visible. There was no light, no sound. For a heart-stopping moment, he feared his trek had been for nothing, that they were already frozen inside. He hammered on the thick wooden door with his numb fists, his shout swallowed by the storm. "Maeve! Maeve Quinn!" The door creaked open, and Rowan stood there, holding a lantern. The boy's face was calm, his eyes wide with surprise. Alastair stumbled past him into the earthen corridor, the sudden silence and stillness a shock to his system. The air was cold, but calm. Rowan closed the heavy door, shutting out the screaming wind completely. "My children," Alastair gasped, his lungs aching. "My house. The roof." Their freezing Maeve appeared at the inner door, her expression unreadable. She held it open for him. Alastair staggered through and into the inner cabin. The warmth hit him like a physical blow. It was a deep, gentle, life-giving heat that seemed to radiate from the very walls. The air was still and quiet, filled with the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. And there, on a rug before the gently glowing stove, sat his salvation. His two small children. And Maeve's twin girls. They were playing with small, smooth stones, their faces flushed with warmth. His children were barefoot. The sight broke him. His son, who had been shivering uncontrollably in their own home, was sitting barefoot and comfortable in the home of the woman he had ridiculed and scorned. The full, crushing weight of his arrogance, his ignorance, his cruelty, came down upon him. He fell to his knees, not from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of his shame. Maeve had not been building a coward's cabin. She had been building an ark. His wife had followed his tracks, her own desperation driving her through the storm, arriving just moments after him with Gregor and a few other men who had seen his light bobbing toward the Quinn place. They all crowded into the earthen corridor, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief as they peered into the scene of impossible warmth and peace. They saw Alastair Finch, the proudest man in the valley, on his knees. They saw his children, safe and barefoot. And they saw Maeve Quinn, standing not as a coward, but as a prophet, a quiet visionary who had seen the truth of the winter while they had all been blind. The humbling of Alastair Finch was absolute, and in the profound, warm silence of the coward's cabin, the entire community was humbled with him. They finally understood. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was a changed place. The valley was buried under a blanket of snow so deep it reshaped the landscape. Several barns had collapsed, and more than one home had been severely damaged. The tale of Alastair Finch's desperate journey and the miracle he found at the Quinn homestead spread faster than fire through a dry field. The community, sobered and shamed, looked at the strange, monstrous cabin with new eyes. They no longer saw a folly, they saw a masterpiece of survival. Alastair Finch, a changed man, was the first to act. He led a group of men to Maeve's home, not with scorn, but with offerings. They brought sacks of flour, salted meats, and a winter's supply of firewood, stacking it neatly against the outer wall. Alastair stood before Maeve, his hat in his hands, his eyes downcast. "Maeve," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "There are no words to say how sorry I am. I was a fool. A proud, blind fool. You saved my children. You saved all of us by showing us what true strength is." Maeve simply nodded, accepting his apology with the same quiet grace with which she had accepted his scorn. Gregor, the blacksmith, was next. He spent a week at her cabin, not helping, but learning. He took measurements, made sketches, and asked quiet questions. He studied the way she had used the earth and moss, the principle of the thermal mass and the air gap. "You've invented something here, Maeve," he told her, his voice filled with a craftsman's reverence. "Something that will change how we all live in this valley." True to his word, he began to incorporate her ideas into his own work. The following summer, no one built a single-walled cabin. They all built them Maeve's way, with a thick, insulated space between the walls. They were not as massive or as crude as hers, for Gregor refined the technique, but the principle was the same. They stopped calling her home the coward's cabin. At first, they called it the Quinn cabin, and then, simply, the hearth. It became a landmark, a testament to a mother's fierce, quiet love. The cabin stood for over a century, a silent monument on the hillside. Long after Maeve and her children were gone, long after the valley had grown into a proper town, the story was still told. They told it to their children on cold winter nights, the tale of the quiet widow who fought a ghost. They spoke of how she listened to the memory of the cold and built a fortress against it, not with weapons or anger, but with wisdom, earth, and an unbreakable will. Her legacy was not written in books or carved in stone. It was lived in the warm, safe homes of the generations that followed, in the quiet confidence that no matter how hard the wind howled, no matter how deep the snow fell, their children would sleep soundly through the night, their small feet warm, their dreams untroubled by the cold.